Bilawal Bhutto Zardari talked about privatization in his campaign. He prefers public-private partnerships. So how do you balance that competing point of view in a coalition will be a question. Choices of finance ministers that it has led to deadlocks with the IMF and caused increased uncertainty. There are still some concerns about a coalition government and how weak or strong it will be. Well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, we know that there will be likely a coalition. In fact, as when we're recording this conversation, it seems like the ex-PTI parties have aligned on forming a coalition, which will ease some uncertainty in the near term. But I think moving forward, an incoming government has three key hurdles to pass if it is to restore investor confidence and in fact build investor confidence in the economy. The first one, of course, is the choice of the finance minister. Whoever comes in to that post has to be seen as a credible actor. And in the past, we've seen, for example, with choices of finance ministers, that it has led to deadlocks with the IMF and caused increased uncertainty. So that's number one. Number two is the task for the government to first conclude the final review of the ongoing SBA with the IMF, and then begin conversations about another IMF program in the coming weeks. And how that review goes through and what we get as readouts from conversations with the IMF will be a key factor. And then finally, by early summer, Pakistan will enter a budget season, and this new government that comes in will have to present its first budget, and all eyes will be on it whether or not the government maintains some level of priority in terms of privatization, making sure it doesn't roll out additional populist measures that enhance the fiscal deficit, and what kind of roadmap it provides through the budget process will be key. So I think at the time being, there are still some concerns about a coalition government and how weak or strong it will be. But now that we have some emerging clarity about the fact that it will indeed be a coalition like the PDM once more, the question now will be about what their priorities are and what the economic roadmap they're willing to provide to the people of Pakistan. Well, I mean, look, the first issue that will come up with and always comes up with any coalition is to balance between competing priorities and ideologies or points of view. For example, we very clearly know that historically the PMLN has been pro-privatization, whereas the People's Party has not been as much in favor of privatization. And we saw this, in fact, in the way in which Mr. Bilawal Bhutto Zardari talked about privatization in his campaign. He prefers public-private partnerships. So how do you balance that competing point of view in a coalition will be a question. Then you have issues about the fact that reforms, especially reforms that challenge the status quo, will and are often resisted. So a weak coalition will obviously find itself on tricky ground when it decides to go after, for example, putting a tax on retailers or the real estate sector in the coming months. So how do you deal with that challenge will be another question mark. But I think those things in a coalition on the economic side can be figured out through conversations and debate. The bigger challenge, of course, will be that the largest party or the largest block of seats in parliament, which consists of the PTI, will be in opposition. And how the PTI and its leadership behaves in opposition will have a bearing on the stability of a coalition, which from day one will have questions around its legitimacy. And number two, it will always be looking behind, looking to make deals or peace with powerful segments of the establishment in Pakistan. Because once that signal comes through, or the government feels that it's insecure, it will, perhaps not be so eager to pass on difficult measures and engage in tactics that perhaps undermine economic stability, primarily because they want political survival or want to do things a bit differently to maintain political control over power. This is something we saw, for example, in 2022. If your viewers will remember that with the Ukraine-Russia war, oil prices were through the roof, and Mr. Khan saw that a no confidence motion was coming towards him and he would be out of power. And so he decided to freeze prices and put in place a petroleum subsidy that then Mr. Shehbaz Sharif's government found it very difficult to roll back. And once they did, they lost a lot of political capital. So I think the issue will be less about economic policies, although that issue will remain, but it will be more about what happens in the political domain and how the PTI behaves, and whether or not there are signals that the PTI is making peace with elements that perhaps ultimately control the levers of power in Pakistan. In my mind, there are three big buckets that they need to tackle. The first one is privatization of loss-making state-owned enterprises, key among them being the PIA. Can a coalition pull this off is the first question. The second order of priority, in fact, much more important than the SOEs in my mind, is energy sector reforms. The circular debt challenge, the mounting cost of energy is basically a huge handicap for Pakistan's economy and its economic growth prospects. So dealing with that, which perhaps might entail privatization of distribution companies, how do you deal with that is going to be another significant challenge, but it should be a priority for the government. And then finally, the government has to look at undertaxed or untaxed segments of the economy, key among them, in my opinion, being the retail sector and real estate. And those both of those sectors are dominated by politically powerful interest groups, and how a coalition navigates that challenge is going to be of note as well. At the end of the day, I think they have to deal with all three of these big bucket issues in the next 6 to 8 months. We must be very honest about the fact that any government, including governments here in the United States, when a new president comes in, basically has 18 months to do the big picture reforms that a president has prioritized. In Pakistan, in my view, the timeline is even shorter. It's probably 12 months or so. So this budget and the rest of this year will be basically make or break time for Pakistan. And if this government, given that it has some level of trust and agreement with the Chief of Army Staff through the SIFC, given Mr. Shehbaz Sharif's role in sort of putting together the SIFC, perhaps has some runway to prioritize these three things. And I would expect that at the very least, they make an aggressive push towards resolving these three challenges, again, being state-owned enterprises, the power energy sector, and then taxation reforms.